Thank you, everyone. Great. This is our first panel of the morning, and this panel is entitled Bridging Foundational, Translational, Clinical, and Public Health Research, Lessons Learned and Future Perspectives. So I think what we're attempting to do during this panel is we have a number of members, and we span the spectrum from those that do basic research all the way to those who do clinical research and actually provide clinical care. And I think that FaceBase is trying to endeavor to serve all of us in terms of whether or not we do basic research or clinical research or we care for patients. And so we really want to understand how we can better utilize FaceBase for us to interact among each other, and also what could be done in the future to enhance, collaboration, not only among the researchers, but also the rest of the scientific community and other groups. So how we'll start today is each of us will introduce ourselves, tell a little bit about how we've contributed to FaceBase and where we sit within the spectrum. And so you can get a flavor of what we do first, and then we'll talk about some of the prospects or lessons learned. Okay, so I'll begin myself. I'm Ethylin Jabs. I'm a medical geneticist. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Clinical Genomics of Mayo Clinic. And I myself span the spectrum because I do wet bench research. Most of my research has been based on using not only human specimens, but also mouse model systems. And I've contributed to FaceBase in terms of depositing a number of gene expression libraries during embryonic development of the wild type mouse, as well as some mutant mouse models. And I myself am a clinician. I see patients, and I see patients with craniofacial disorders. So I myself am thinking about always bridging between what I see and do in the lab with what I do in terms of care of my patients.
Hi, good morning. My name is Junichi Iwata from University of Texas, Houston. So I'm a professor at Department of Diagnostic and Biomedical Sciences. I'm working on craniofacial biology mainly using the mouse models. And I was lucky enough, I could start my, when I started my career, so this FaceBase also started. So that's why when I was postdoc at Dr. Yan Chai's lab, so I would see how the FaceBase started. And then now, so I can see that this very much grows, this FaceBase, and the community is very friendly and kind to support the new faculty. So that's why at the UT, the Houston, I was very much good experience with the FaceBase.
Hello, everybody. I'm Antonio Porras. I am an assistant professor of biostatistics and informatics at the Colorado School of Public Health, and I'm also research director of plastic surgery at Children's Hospital, Colorado. My expertise is on computer science. I'm an engineer, and I had the real fun, this really fun double role in which I had the opportunity to get involved with physicians at the very beginning to fully understand what the clinical problem is. And then I also had the opportunity to work on the creation of very specific computational tools and machine learning models or methods that allow us to tackle those clinical problems. And then at the end of the pipeline, also had the opportunity to work on the translation of these methods and the creation of tools that can actually help with patient management at the hospital.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jay Patel, and I'm an assistant professor of informatics And I'm also Center Director for the Dental Informatics and Artificial Intelligence at Temple University. I'm a dentist and I have a PhD in informatics. My PhD mentor is sitting right there, Dr. Saivali Kakat. When I was practicing dentistry, I found many problems. Some treatments worked in certain populations, some did not, and that really inspired me. How can we use this real world data and real world information for decision making? In simple words, it's good to say that what worked and what did not work. And that inspired me to go to this route. And my research include developing prediction models and learning health systems using real-world electronic health record data sets for predictive modeling and decision making.
Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Feigelson. I am the project manager for the International Family Study at Operation Smile. And the bulk of our work focuses on environmental and genetic risk factors for cleft lip and palate. So we're looking more at the public health perspective.
Great. So I think we're going to try to address a number of questions here. And I'd like everyone to participate and be interactive, make comments, or ask us questions as well. So enter your questions in the chat box, or if you're here, please also ask your questions with the mic. So I think one of the first things we want to address is there a role for data reuse? And how would you describe the role of data reuse in your area along the translational spectrum? So we'll begin with you, Dr. Lada.
So I think the role of the data reuse is actually we can save the time and effort and the budget. So especially when I started with FaceBase data sets, to start analyze the database, FaceBase data sets. So actually, I and the postdoc can save a lot of time, and also since we didn't have much time to making the data from the merge, so that's why we could save the time. And also that is not only the time, this is also we can save the budget as well. So especially the new investigators, and students and trainees. So this is very critical to share these data sets, reuse the data sets as well. And also now more recently, I start with the students, and this data set is also very valuable and useful in the education, the training. So since this data set is already analyzed by experts, and that is also published. So that's why the student and trainee can reuse the same data set and then getting the same results. So that is the first step to understand how we can analyze the data. Then in the advanced stage, actually the student and trainee can apply some new the methodology using the same data set. That is the kind of advanced stage. But from the beginning, so we can use that data for the training and education, then going to some kind of advanced the methodology.
Yes, in my case, most of the work that we do is based on clinical images. And we have been working on two very specific areas where data reuse has been at the center. On one hand, we have been working very hard on trying to create normative models that can be used as a reference of cranial development in kids. And in this specific scenario, we're talking about normative kids. So the only way you can do this is just by going back and trying to find those images that have been incidentally acquired for whatever other reason. So these are secondary research studies. By definition, everything we do is reusing data that has been acquired for other purposes. And on the other hand, we are very specifically focused on the study of craniosynostosis. And despite not being a rare disease, it's rare enough. So if you try to do a prospective study to focus on answering a very specific question, the number of patients that you would see at a single institution would be very, very reduced. There are very few hospitals in this country that see more than 100 new patients every year. We're one of those, but there are just a handful of them. So again, all the research that has been done in this area using imaging data has been fully retrospective and just like trying to go back, curate all the images you have, enabling collaborations between different institutions. So I would say that without data reuse, our research is just not possible at all.
Great, I agree with the other panelists. I will add some perspective from the electronic health record reuse. This data set has not been collected for research purpose. It has been collected for billing, mainly billing purpose. However, it has so much potential to demonstrate real world population. We are not restricted by strict inclusion and exclusion criteria that other prospective studies may have. So at least it gives us the initial guide towards what is the problem that exists. It gives us guide to which direction we should do clinical studies. So data really represent. Now we are talking about samples of 30,000, 40,000, 60,000 unique patients. That are the sample size now we are talking about. Also, our patient, our oral health is connected with systemic health, and we are trying to get a bigger picture by linking the medical data with the dental data. And linking the electronic health record data with FaceBase data will give this unique opportunity to find more associated factors. And finally, it also helps us validate certain methods. So for example, there are some data challenges that are already universities are starting, where we give them de-identified data sets of millions and millions of rows, and it's a challenge. Students come up with different AI methods. Some develop deep learning, some develop machine learning, and then they compete with each other. But what we are actually doing out of it is we are trying to find the best method to answer that research question. So there are many advantages, and obviously it's very less expensive, less time consuming, and by the time we achieve some results, some information, knowledge, wisdom, we can apply it right away to the clinical practice. We don't have to wait for 10, 20, 30 years. Thank you.
I think for me, from the public health perspective and also from the perspective of the study that I manage, since we're a case control study, I think our control samples can be reused for a lot of different projects. But I also think for our cases, our cleft patients in particular, I think we're creating a really unique data set that can be used as a validation tool, kind of building off of what Jay said, in a lot of different ways. And I think reusing other data as a method for validation as well. And I think that's mostly where we see our data being most valuably reused. And I think the other is in that our study looks at populations from low and middle income countries, underrepresented populations in research. And I think there's a lot of room there for data reuse and the inclusion of our population as well, to strengthen previous findings, which also ties a little bit into validation.
That's great. Do we have any comments from anyone else here? Or yeah, go ahead, Axel. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Jay. So I was wondering, so in your work, when you like on a daily basis, like look at general and oral health, electronic health records, what are the major challenges that you encounter, and do you see a potential place for FaceBase in helping overcoming some of these, and how do you envision linking this to FaceBase? like what would be most valuable for you from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. The biggest challenge that I have encountered is the data quality because this data is not collected for research. So information can be present in different sections. We don't have good quality of diagnosis, which is, we should have diagnosis, but it's more procedure-based care. We get reimbursed from procedures, not really diagnosis. So how can we use these different methods to first get the diagnosis out? Then we can do more information. So I think 90% of the time that I spend is cleaning the data, making sure the data quality is good, so we can avoid garbage in, garbage out situation. There is absolutely potential to link the face-based data with the electronic health record data, because there are many linking algorithms are being available now. So in medicine, there is a health share exchange where they have every state has linked medical records. We have to link that first with the dental records, create a repository, and then link with the face-based data. Or moving forward, we should start collecting all this information for the current patients and moving forward. But if we look into retrospectively, we have to go that route. But it is possible. It may take some time, but it's possible.
Hi, I have a question about data reuse. I would love to hear the panel's thoughts on data reuse outside of your home institution and making it more broadly reusable. Can you please share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think a number of things the panelists have already talked about is something that we interact with other people outside of our institution. I think when I gave my talk yesterday, what I was really pleased about seeing is somebody had used our single-cell RNA-seq data from a whole nother institution for a whole nother reason. They're in the field of neurology, and they were able to apply it and use it successfully to define different cell types to distinguish it from neuronal cells. So, I mean, that's great example of reuse that I thought. And so I think what FaceBase can deliver is that it's almost like in the old days, you would teach someone, well, look at the literature first. How did they use their methods? How did they do things? Well, maybe the first thing we should be telling people and trainees in our lab is go look at FaceBase first. What's in FaceBase? Use that first as your beginning step, to see what's there so you don't have to reinvent the wheel and then go from there. And I think some of the things the panelists have brought up as well is that having that data there, then it can generate hypotheses for everybody. And I think it's a wonderful one-stop shopping for craniofacial researchers for inspiration and not just for application. Yeah. Anybody else have anything to say?
I have a quick comment. I think building off of that comment as well, I think I've used this analogy a lot this week, but we're all often kind of in these bubbles. And so I think building a data repository that's able to be reused is a great way to break out of those bubbles, because other researchers with different backgrounds are able to look at the same data and think about it completely differently. And so I know for me, building the repository that we're creating is wonderful for this particular purpose, but I know someone else can look at that and think of 1,000 ways that they could use it for their research and for different ways. So I think that would be a great thing to consider with regards to data reuse.
I'll add one comment for real quick, is that also we need some policies and governance too, because the issue is it's not that the universities or private practice do not want to share the data, but we are all afraid of HIPAA and privacy and bridging issues. And even though we say de-identified, is it really de-identified? I personally think that any of this data can be linked back. There are automated approach, there are good researchers, and there are some on the other side too who always try to bridge this. So I think that's where the most I see that concern. People want to share, but then they're afraid, and then they get dimmed down by the central offices for data sharing.
And another way that I think FaceBase is moving towards greater reuse and just informing the community of what's out there is, for example, in our studies, we've now been downloading all of our phenotype data to FaceBase, which is a huge amount of data from a variety of different realms, from speech pathology, medical history, lots of images, 3D facial images, intraoral images, et cetera, from all of our data sets. And that's never been in one place under controlled access. So it's controlled access, Jay. So it should not, it's already been approved for sharing. So thanks.
Yes, thanks, Mimi. This is Wang from NIDCR. I just want to talk about the difference between public sharing through controlled access and data not shareable in a public way. And then I have a question for the panel. Even at today's event, I'm hearing statements or questions that makes me feel there is still a distinction that needs to be made. So what I'm saying is for everyone in the room and those of us participating online. Ever since the genomic data sharing days, NIH has always pushed for data sharing through open access and controlled access. Both are ways for public data sharing. So when consent is, when the IRB deems a data set shareable according to the original consent, but through controlled access, that is I can say that's a green light for public data sharing. But when we hear from some PIs about I cannot share my data because there's identifiability in the data because of the consent, that is a confusion. So consent oftentimes allows public data sharing through controlled access that acknowledges data identifiability, particularly down the road when there's new methods, new technology platforms. I just want to say this whenever I have the opportunity. It's up, it's up to all of us to really implement public data sharing in an appropriate way, including through controlled access. Thank you. And then my question is mainly for Antonio. To me, the aspiration in the data science space is that going forward more and more, I see the possibility for investigators to look into critical biomedical questions at a depth and scale unimaginable before. So to achieve that goal and leverage technology advances and the growing big data, how much value do you see in legacy data sets versus, growing new data sets? Thank you.
I mean, I think the value of a legacy data set is really high, right? Those are data sets that are really hard to put together, and let alone grow them with multi-institutional data. So what kind of happens when the project is over, that data set disappears, right? So I think it's of utmost importance to be able to make those data sets available to the community. So we build on top on what each other has done versus starting from scratch every single time. I do think, and I wanted to follow up with what you commented before, there is a lot of situations in which we just cannot share the data just because it's a secondary research study, and I'm talking about the kind of research we do where, you have patients' faces and patients have not consented for data sharing. So the last thing we can do is to provide that data to anybody else. So I think that's one of the big challenges as well that we need to account for, even though there is a very pressing need of being able to make these data sets available to answer all those questions that we haven't been able to answer without these data sets. We also need to be very, very, very wary about patient privacy. And it's really hard to walk that line in which you can respect patient privacy and make data sets available at the same time. That's why, and my team that we have recently started to do, and not because we have funding for it, but because we are trying to push this to create models that can generate realistic synthetic data. So even though we cannot share specific patient data, we can share data that looks like real patients. And maybe that's a middle line that we can start walking and putting more resources on in the short term.
Yeah, thank you. So a follow-up question then, while as founders, we are always trying our best and following guidelines to protect study participants' privacy. That's why we require appropriate data sharing. At the same time, what do you think about the value of summary level data that are not at individual levels? Particularly, I'm going back to legacy data sets again. You know, if a consent for a legacy data set was lacking succinct language that allows individual level data sharing through controlled access, how do you see using the approach of sharing summary level data be helpful and feasible? Thank you.
I think it's really helpful for a lot of different research projects. In our team, we've made available summary data such as intracranial volumes, cephalic indices, specific metrics of malformations, working on craniofacial dysmorphology. That definitely has enabled others to do the research, to compare their findings with ours, and that is extremely important. However, and I also want to follow up on something that was said before, we also need to be careful about what exact summary data we are sharing, because sometimes we think it may not be identifiable, but it is. And an example yesterday was hearing about specific projects that were isolating parts of the calvarium patients and sharing only that area. And I think assuming that you cannot identify a patient by looking at the cranial bones is, for example, and this is just an example, it may be a little bit simplistic. I think that's a lot of work in identifying bone density. Every patient has a very specific bone density pattern when you look locally. And if I ask my student, can you tell me who this patient is, given just the bone density, they will be able to tell me who that is. So I think we still need to be very careful about those things, but I agree with you. The value is tremendous.
Thank you.
I just want to add a comment to what, just to clarify, when we are working with EHR data, we have to comply with not only an IRB approval, but also with the legal compliance, especially HIPAA and confidentiality. So everything that panelists said, especially Antonio and Jay, that is the dilemma we experience. And the challenge with reusing EHR-based data is healthcare systems. We just cannot, as if the data will be reused for the same, to answer the same research question, maybe extending the research question, that's allowed. Otherwise, we have to go back to all healthcare organizations and get their consent, their approval and we cannot reuse that data. We have to do a refresh of the data to answer a different research question. Those are the checks that healthcare systems have put in place to ensure that they are complying with HIPAA and privacy regulations, because it's huge. If they get fined, it's in millions. So they have they have to respect their patients.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Thank you, Tanka. And just to push a little further so that I fully understand the challenge we are facing. do I understand it correctly that the general practice, appropriate practice to protect privacy and enable research then is to not allow any data sharing if there is identifiability intrinsic in a data set. Identifiability doesn't mean identification. I'm not getting a clear distinction between these two, which is, the question I've always had unanswered.
So I think that is a very gray area. And it's really hard to establish a line when you say now you can identify, now you cannot in a lot of data sets. I don't think the current guidelines or regulations fully address that very clearly, just because probably cannot happen. So there is a big role that each of us on the research side play when we are collecting data and when we are analyzing data, and we sometimes have to make some of those decisions. I think I agree, identifiability should not necessarily prevent data sharing, and I fully agree with you on that. However, when we are looking at data sets for which patients have not provided direct consent, I personally would not be inclined to sharing that data. And I'm just sharing, if I had a kid and my kid goes to a clinic and 10 years later, I see a researcher putting my kid's face somewhere, or dealing with my kids, I probably would not like that because I did not consent for that. And I think that, guidelines probably need to be revised and then continuously improve on that, but it's probably more of trying to find agreements in the community or what is allowed, what is not, having this kind of discussion that we are having right now to make sure that everybody kind of follows the same route before making a decision whether they can share specific data or not.
I want to make a statement that I work for the government, and I am one of the chairs of the NIDCR Data Access Committee, so we work hard to protect all study participants' privacy. I was pushing the envelope because I wanted to understand, in general, what is the safeguard approach we are taking. Thank you.
I have a question. So I had this question a few questions back. so we're going to rewind a little bit. So I think it's for Devin. You said you guys at Operation Smile are building your own repository so you can share your data. Are you doing this because of data access restrictions concerns, or is it because there's no place or that place that's ideally placed or situated for the kind of data you're trying to put in? What are the reasons why or is it so you can actually control who gets it? What are the reasons why you would go through this process of building your own versus just putting it somewhere else that is already existing?
It's a great question. The first reason is that it logistically was the easiest thing for us to do. The second reason is that we have as we continue to collect samples and collect data from families, we wanted to create an easier route for us to share data, and this was what we were advised by our IRB is the first step is to create this repository, and then either we can share that entire repository or we can share parts of it, but it's all been, because we now have this single repository, it allows us to be a little bit more in control and also to ensure that anything that we do regarding data sharing is covered by its own set of IRB approved guidelines that allows us to kind of have strict understanding of what we are and are not allowed to do in terms of our sharing. Does that fully answer your question?
So people would have to request data from you, and then do you guys, kind of like we have a data access committee here, you guys will see, we find out what they want to use it for, and if that follows the consents and everything, HIPAA, whatever rules of the country, sometimes, because you guys work internationally, right?
Sure.
So you also have to look at the rules of the country in which you collected the data and all of that.
So at this time, that's exactly how it works. However, because we're relatively new, and this repository was established months ago, we we are, kind of exploring options to share that, and that could be that we just share all of the data that's covered under this IRB with FaceBase, or it could be that we continue to kind of middleman it and gatekeep a little bit and say, come to us with what you want and we will send you the data that you want. We're still figuring out what works best for us. We have to keep in mind the countries, like you said. We have to keep in mind a bit of a unique situation that our patients are put in, and they show up for free cleft care and not necessarily to be involved in research. So we have to consider that as well. But establishing the repository first was just the easiest thing for us to do, and now we're kind of learning, now that we have this, what's the best approach for the data that's contained within there. Thank you. Yeah.
Devin, is it okay to mention our project briefly?
Sure.
So we're collaborating with Operation Smile on a sequencing study of a couple other populations, and just to say that they were very foresighted in keeping track of their consent forms and developing them with the most recent language, so that the language in the consent forms for our collaboration does allow sharing. And it's funded by, the sequencing is funded by an NIH grant. So the data will be deposited in DeepGap, and that's all fine for controlled access sharing. And then whether FaceBase is something to be discussed in the future, but anyway. So they've really been very foresighted all along, I think, in how they set stuff up. They've moved, slowly and deliberately, and kept all their countries involved, and have been very careful with their documentation and regulatory.
Because one of the reasons why I also ask about the different country governance rules is one of the projects I'm involved in, DSI Africa. That's one of the barriers to data sharing. The different countries involved have different rules about how you can share their data and who can have access to their data, where and how. So I wonder if that's also a consideration for you, given that you guys are international.
Yeah, and the study has collected data in 9 countries, but not all 9 countries are represented in that database. There's a few reasons for that. But some countries were very specific about how they wanted us to consent patients. So we have all of our samples from DRC, for example, are with verbal consent, which means that none of those samples can be used for NIH research. We are still able to share some of those samples. I believe we've actually shared them with Aziz for some of his projects, but those samples will never be able to be shared for NIH purposes because of the fact that they were all verbal consents. And we've stopped data collection in certain countries because we've had issues with our consent language and how we want to collect samples. So we've stopped in Morocco, for example. They're very protective of their control population that we want. So we aren't able to collect controls. So we have to assess, what's worth it for us with regards to case collections there. So yes, our repository of sorts is not representative of all the data that we've collected, but we have different levels of what we're able to share with all of the samples that we have collected. It just varies based off of where they're collected from and the consent that was used. Thank you.
Can I just make a clarification regarding loose point? And then Devin, you brought this up, and Antonia as well. Just so we are all on the same page, when we are talking about data sharing, we are not talking about patient consent to treatment, right? For example, Antonio, we are not talking about your child that you took to a hospital that you did not consent to participate in research, and their face now shows up in a study. That is not the data that we are talking about. I think specifically we are talking about patients who have consented to participate in research, and then the question is does this consent cover data reuse, data sharing within the institution, outside the institution? Does this consent include the very vague identifiable data umbrella that we have right now? So at no point is anyone suggesting that, and for Devin, patients have come to you for treatment. Nobody is expecting unconsented patient data to be shared at all. I just wanted to make that very, very clear so that there is no doubt about that. We are only talking about patients who have consented for their data to be used for research, and we are trying to explore the boundaries of that consent. And I think we have heard from all of you that it differs in different situations, in different institutions. So that's really the information that we are looking for.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Dr. Sanchez?
I love the conversation, being a clinician, seeing and consenting and differentiating between consent and informed consent. I think it's important. I think we had talked to the hub and a lot of the leadership about how many levels of protection there is. And it's important to differentiate risks and perceived risks. And so you as a content expert can definitely use all the resources available to find that one person in that genome and it's fun exercises, but are there actual risks that outweigh the benefits of the collaboration? And so I think FaceBase has so many levels that would be the right resource to say the Data Access Committee would go through all the IRBs. Everybody would surpass all the concerns that people have. And I think us as the leadership in the research community should feel very comfortable having these conversations to say, of course I'll have my kid in these databases because it's ethical and it's for the benefit for the projects that we're working on.
And if I may just comment on both comments together, I think we're all in the same page, so we're all talking exactly about the same thing. I think the issue, the traditional issue in my specific area of research is diseases are so rare at a single institution. There are so few patients that research without only using retrospective data has just not been possible. That's why for us, those two questions are very linked. It's not, we are only talking about the possibility of sharing retrospective data because there is barely any prospective data. And that's why so many of us so happy that NIDCR is currently sponsoring and supporting a project to prospectively acquire images at different institutions that is led by Dr. Gosen, and that we all talked about it yesterday. I agree also with you about being comfortable and having a resource like FaceBase where we're all comfortable to share this data, and it's extremely important. But just talking about what I just said, in some situations, it's just not possible.
So Jennifer, you had a question?
Can any of the panelists share your experience combining data sets for reuse and analysis to increase maybe analytical power, issues with access, harmonization?
Okay, so yeah, I'll answer that real quick. So what we have done at Temple University is that we have used the raw data to come to some kind of a diagnosis or some kind of information that cannot be linked back. So for example, we look into 1,000 periodontal charts and x-rays, but then the diagnosis will be they have generalized periodontitis. That's it. So those layers of that information are now our students use that information for their research. They are looking into association for something else. But so that we have that pipeline, we are working on fixing that pipeline and having a server where they all have a login access, and then they use that data set for research.
I wonder, Mary Marizika can talk about combining data, especially GWAS data has been challenging at times. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, panel. I wanted to ask, as FaceBase expands to include other data types and other different types of DLC data, I'm aware that in other areas like infectious disease and at some other institutions, their focus is on an opt-out informed consent. Okay? And I wanted to ask about the consideration of that, and has it been employed yet for FaceBase? Because it could be a great resource. I'll give an example. The infectious disease clinic that I worked with, every patient that came in had and it's, okay, you've recently been diagnosed with this disease. In this clinic, there are multiple different types of research opportunities that occur. We have a database, and there's a potential for data reuse here. These types of questions will be asked, and maybe other questions in the future. We plan that if you don't say you want to opt out of doing this, that we will include you as part of this study, right? And so it's every person who comes in the door and is eligible is provided the opportunity to opt out. Otherwise, they may have made the choice to opt in, right? And that's been actually quite helpful in that space. So as we think about different types of DOC data and maybe data across schools, looking at salivary gland diseases and perio and craniofacial and others, that may be a great opportunity. Carl?
I'll turn this on. So I've been thinking about this a little bit as this conversation has been going on. And so maybe just a couple of thoughts. So, I mean, also along these lines, right? So the role of FaceBase, of course, is we do not generate any data within our activity. We're not funded to do that. That's not part of our model. We're, in some sense, a convener. So, as a convener, then also this kind of amorphous discussion about clinical data and EHR, as an engineer, strikes me a little bit of let's boil the ocean. Kind of trying to synthesize all this, I'm going to turn the question back around, which is that as a convener, what could we do to help kind of motivate and organize a more focused and structured conversation around data reuse that would allow either NIDCR or the community to, as you're going and doing these things, to have some idea of let's structure this. If we just do a little bit more, right, we can fit into this framework and do the integration and promote some of the reuse and do these kinds of things. Right, so how could we structure the conversation that way? Maybe we focus on certain syndromes. Maybe we focus on certain elements. Maybe we focus on standardizing a consent model so that whenever stuff is funded by NADCR or foundations or whatever, it's kind of set up, right, so that then we can convene that, right? And then how do we look at what are synergies, because we have a bunch of these maybe bigger projects or smaller single investigator awards. How can we look at synergies where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And we can all kind of fulfill our role within the various funding mandates that we have. And I wonder if we could, if that makes sense. Because I'm thinking, how do I operationalize this conversation, right? And what I hear is like, So I wonder if there's like this kind of structure or containment we can put on this that would allow us to make some progress and create something that would actually then be of value with respect to reuse.
I just want to make a comment. You know, the data management sharing new form that we have to put in with our applications or when we get annual renewal, maybe in that context, you could ask investigators, not only, you know, are they data sharing, but also if you're going to deposit it into FaceBase and NIDCR, what are you, not only what are you depositing and what data will you reuse? So that would be, it would almost put into action that investigators think first about, are they going to reuse FaceBase data? And also I think the role of NIDCR for those who are funded is that the standardization of the IRB and all that. I think maybe at that level, because then our institutions individually will listen to that because they want us to be funded. Every institution's IRB is functioning differently. And even within an institution, different IRB committees will look at the same consent and tell us to change it a different way. So I think we need it from a very high level to standardize it, but just a suggestion.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, because we're already faith-based, we view part of our responsibility the help of the DMPs, and we're building out material around that. So maybe digging down, in particular with this kind of these more clinical studies, right? Digging down to the next level of detail and coming with agreement as, okay, our DMPs, now we're going to actually tell you what vocabulary to use, right? And get to that next level of detail, then, you know, if we could have community agreement on that, so now we're kind of slotting it in. And I agree, fighting the fight against all the institutional IRBs is not a battle I want to have, right? It's a losing proposition. So if we can end run that by saying, here's the DMP, we as a community agree on that. Here's all the forms, we'll help you fill that out. We'll give you tools to help you fill that out. And IDCR will expect you to fill that out in this way. I think that's a great way of bringing some order to this process.
But I'm just not talking about clinical. Let's talk about any other organisms that we're less concerned about identifiability. I just think if you have a question, you know, you're sharing this data, how can it be reused? And then what data are you reusing? You know, to have people think about reusing data in the future. But I will say, having been in this business a long time, this keeps evolving. And your question about what's identifiable versus identification is going to change over time, because I was very surprised by what Antonio said. I didn't realize bone mineral density could be identifiable at the individual level. Was not aware of that. And if that's the case with AI, if they start synthesizing everything, they're going to be able to identify everybody here with the data that we're collecting. It's really, who knows what the future will be. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's what we need to be very careful with, because there's many things that we are not able to do nowadays, but we may be able to do in 5 years from now, and we need to be able to prevent some adverse outcomes. Answering the question, I think something that could be really useful for FaceBase is that right now it's very focused on data, and it's great because that's the purpose of FaceBase. But nowadays, in the era of AI, most of the data we generate are actual learned patterns, are models, are statistics. And those are the things that are actually also going to enable the translation of those fundings from the projects. So, there are many companies like NVIDIA that are big in AI that are starting to make public all these frameworks to create pipelines, to share models for other institutions to just reuse what you have learned from your own data set. And I think that a good way to move forward with FaceBase is to start supporting those things, because that is the main reason why my team, instead of putting our models through FaceBase, where there is no framework right now, we have to use GitHub and put instructions and write them down and teach people how to use our models. And I think that would be a really good way to move forward with people like us to share our findings.
Yeah, I'll just add something. So I was also thinking of having a second layer of data science pipelines. So this is a completely raw data set, and this is the layer where people want to have access. So this will only try to find information that at that point is not identifiable, but at the same time it is usable. So having those automated systems may at least do the first round of filtering, and then there can be human check here or there to make sure that it is working fine. That may make it more accessible.
I think hearing more from Carl and how much security and how things are evolving, more cloud-based analysis and sandbox that don't allow bulk download and it's regulated and monitored, I think that'll make people feel more comfortable. And then going back to the comment about pooled data is very difficult to pull out individual information. Anonymized and anonymous is evolving, but again, going back to the risks and who's getting access, that committee of truly trusted people and then their team and documenting those people, I think we're getting more comfortable with that, but I think we all should know what's in place versus I'm going to build it myself. Yeah, I know what I'm doing, and then you find out there's a bunch of holes.
I think we've reached the end of our time, but there's so much more we want to talk about. Go ahead,
Okay.
if we want to talk into our break.
Just
yeah.
two quick things to share with you. One is ongoing initiation of collaborations both with NIMHD and with NIGMS, their sandbox, for tools that can be utilized in the cloud for our community. Right? And then the second is to what you shared with us, what could happen at just in time. At NIDCR, we've begun thinking about building a tool to do just that. To say, okay, what are the major outcomes? What would be the common data elements associated with that? What specimens are you collecting? What models are you using? What repository or suggested repository would you point to? And then people will begin depositing their data at the beginning of the data life cycle, not at the end of the project, to a point that Carl made earlier. So we're working on developing something like that so that people can utilize it to the point that you made earlier.
Dr. To follow up on, no. I was just saying Dr. Thankam had her microphone on. No? Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on what Jennifer mentioned about the opt-in and opt-out. So we can do that. In fact, in our school at Indiana University, way back in 2014, we reconsented all of our patients, and that actually has helped us in linking their dental data with their medical record data. And only, I don't want to share how many, but I can tell you it's less than 100 or even less than 50 who opted out of sharing their data for any research. So we can do that. Patient consenting, that is the responsibility of the data originating site. So I'm not sure whether FaceBase can really help with that. Definitely FaceBase can help with creating best practices that could be informative for investigators, what they should be looking for, like a checklist and best practices. But actually the data originating site is responsible for the patient consenting. And that is possible for prospective studies, not for retrospective. Any retrospective, IRB approved protocol or IRB approved consent is not, that alone is not sufficient. We also have to look at the consent they have provided when they sign up for patient care with that healthcare system. So that's why it's two things. They're two separate things. Oftentimes, that second part is not taken into consideration during NIH data sharing policy.
So thank you all so much. Yes, I think, we need to wrap up so we can go into our next panel. But thank you all so much, and thank you, Ethylin Jabs and the whole panel. And we're going to take a 5-minute break and then come back for our second panel of the day. Thank you.